Growing up, I always felt like I was carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders. At just 20, I was already working overtime shifts at the local diner, trying to make ends meet for my family. My dad passed away years ago, leaving my mom, Mary, to manage the household. Or rather, to pretend to manage it. Most days, she lounged on the couch, scrolling through her phone or chatting with friends, while I busted my back to pay the bills. My younger brother Jack, 17, was no better. He'd gotten himself into trouble with the law more times than I could count, and any money he earned doing odd jobs seemed to vanish into thin air. And Emily, my 15-year-old sister? She spent her days perfecting TikTok dances and whining about how hard her life was. It wasn't like I didn't love them. I did. But love alone couldn't make up for the constant imbalance. I'd been giving everything I had, emotionally and financially, and receiving almost nothing in return. I tried to push the resentment aside, telling myself that family comes first, but each day it became harder to ignore the growing knot in my chest. The final straw came on my 20th birthday. I'd worked a double shift the night before, hoping to save enough for a little celebration, but by the time I got home, the house was dark. No decorations, no balloons, not even a card. I thought maybe they'd planned a surprise, and were just waiting for the right moment. I went to bed hopeful, imagining that tomorrow would be different. When morning came, there was a small gathering in the living room. Jack and Emily were already digging into a cake from the grocery store, barely looking up as I walked in. My mom handed me a gift bag with a strained smile. Inside was a generic set of bath products. Soap, lotion, and a loofah. That was it. I tried not to let it show, but my stomach twisted. It wasn't the gift itself that hurt me. It was the principle. The week before, Jack had celebrated his birthday with a brand new gaming console that must have cost hundreds of dollars. For Emily's birthday last month, they'd gotten her a spa day complete with a luxury skincare package. But for me, soap. I sat there, gripping the bag, as the rest of them carried on like nothing was wrong. My mom laughed about some joke Jack had made, while Emily scrolled through her phone. Not once did anyone ask how I was feeling, or notice the tears welling up in my eyes. It hit me like a freight train. I wasn't just the family workhorse. I was an afterthought. Later that evening, I found myself staring at the bathroom mirror, clutching the cheap lotion. Memories of all the times I'd sacrificed for them flashed through my mind. The nights I skipped meals so they could eat, the shifts I picked up so Jack's fines could get paid, the hours I spent tutoring Emily so she wouldn't fail math. And for what? A set of soap that probably came from the clearance aisle. For the first time, anger replaced the guilt I'd carried for years. I'd been making excuses for them, rationalizing their behavior, but now I couldn't ignore the truth. They didn't see me as a person. To them, I was just someone who kept the lights on and the fridge stocked. I realized then and there that something had to change. This wasn't a family. It was a one-sided arrangement. I started to think about what my life could look like if I put myself first. The idea was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. Could I really walk away? Could I leave Jack and Emily to fend for themselves? Could I tell my mom that her freeloading days were over? That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with possibilities, plans, and a nagging fear of the unknown. But one thought kept rising above the noise. I deserved better. For the first time in my life, I believed it. And I decided I'd do whatever it took to prove it. The path forward wasn't clear, but I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't be their doormat any longer. This was the start of something new. I wasn't sure how or when, but I was going to change my life. I owed that much to myself. After my birthday, things didn't exactly improve. The tension in the house felt thicker than ever, and every little interaction became a reminder of just how one-sided my role in the family had become. The breaking point came a few days later, during a heated argument with my mom. It started when she asked for money to cover some urgent expenses for Jack. I'd just gotten off a grueling double shift and barely had enough left for my own needs, let alone anyone else's. When I hesitated, her expression turned cold. She said I was being selfish and that family always came first. Hearing those words hit me like a slap. I'd been putting family first for years, and where had it gotten me? The argument escalated quickly. My mom accused me of abandoning my responsibilities, throwing in comments about how ungrateful I was and how much she'd sacrificed for us. It was the same script she'd used before, but this time it didn't work. Something inside me snapped, and I told her I was done being their personal ATM. Her face twisted with anger, and she shot back, saying I was turning my back on them and that I'd regret it. She even managed to tear up, playing the victim like she always did, but it didn't move me the way it used to. After she stormed off, I sat in the kitchen, staring at the pile of unpaid bills she'd left on the table. For the first time, I saw them for what they really were, her responsibility, not mine. I'd been carrying the weight of this family for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to live for myself. But now, the realization hit me like a freight train. I couldn't keep doing this. Not for them, not for anyone. That night, I started to really think about my life and where it was headed. I thought about all the dreams I'd pushed aside, going back to school, traveling, even something as simple as taking a weekend off without feeling guilty. I'd sacrificed so much for them, and it had gotten me nothing but exhaustion and resentment. If I didn't change something soon, I knew I'd end up stuck in this cycle forever. The idea of leaving terrified me, but it also felt like the only way forward. I started small, making a plan in my head. The first step was to save money, not for groceries or Jack's fines or Emily's endless list of wants, but for me. I decided to start setting aside whatever I could from each paycheck, no matter how small. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I also knew I had to set boundaries. That meant saying no when they asked for money or favors that went beyond what I could handle. It felt cruel at first, like I was abandoning them, but I reminded myself that I wasn't responsible for fixing their messes. They were grown enough to make their own choices, and it was time for them to deal with the consequences. The first test came sooner than I expected. Jack got into trouble again, something about a fight at school, and my mom immediately came to me, expecting me to cover the costs of the damages. When I said no, her reaction was explosive. She accused me of letting the family fall apart, of being heartless and selfish. For a moment, I almost caved, but then I thought about all the times I'd put myself last for their sake. This time, I held firm. It wasn't easy, but it felt like a small victory. Over the next few weeks, I started to see changes, not in them, but in me. I felt lighter, freer, even though the guilt still lingered in the back of my mind. I started to imagine a future where I wasn't tied down by their expectations. It wasn't just a fantasy anymore, it was something I could actually work towards. I knew it would take time and patience, but for the first time in years, I felt hopeful. One night, as I lay in bed, I thought about what it would be like to leave for good. To find my own place, build my own life, and finally take control of my destiny. The idea scared me, but it also filled me with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. I didn't have all the answers yet, but I knew one thing for sure. I was done being their scapegoat. This was my life, and it was time to start living it on my terms. 2 months later, I finally stood in the doorway of my own apartment, a tiny but cozy one-bedroom that I could call mine. The walls were bare, the furniture mismatched, but none of that mattered. It was mine. Moving out hadn't been easy. My family's resistance was stronger than I had anticipated. My mom had accused me of abandoning them, Jack had slammed his bedroom door, and Emily had sobbed dramatically, but I'd stood firm. This was something I had to do for myself, no matter how much they tried to guilt me into staying. Thankfully, I wasn't alone in this transition. My friends Lisa and Janet, both co-workers from the diner, had been incredibly supportive. On moving day, they showed up with boxes, snacks, and enough pep talks to get me through the chaos. It felt surreal to have people in my life who genuinely wanted to help without expecting anything in return. As we unloaded the last box, I felt a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. This was the first step toward the freedom I'd dreamed of. Settling into my new life was both exciting and overwhelming. I'd never realized how much of my identity had been tied to taking care of my family. Now, with no one to answer to but myself, I had to figure out who I was outside of that role. I started small, decorating the apartment with secondhand finds and little touches that made the space feel like home. A colorful rug here, a thrifted lamp there. Each piece felt like a declaration of independence. Socially, I began to branch out in ways I never had before. Lisa and Janet invited me to join them for outings after work, and I found myself saying yes instead of making excuses. We went to karaoke nights, explored local markets, and even had a few impromptu game nights at my place. For the first time, I felt like I was part of something that didn't revolve around obligation or guilt. It was liberating. Around this time, Lisa introduced me to a friend of hers, a guy named Brian. He was kind, funny, and had a way of making me feel seen in a way I wasn't used to. We started seeing each other casually, and though it was early days, it felt good to have someone in my corner. He wasn't perfect, no one is, but he respected my boundaries and supported my goals, which was more than I'd ever experienced in my family. For the first month in my new apartment, I felt like I was finally starting to breathe. The weight that had pressed on my chest for years was beginning to lift. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living. Of course, there were moments of doubt. Late at night, I'd catch myself wondering if I'd done the right thing. But then I'd look around at the life I was building and remind myself why I'd made this choice. Then, out of nowhere, my family reached out. After a full month of silence, no texts, no calls, not even a passive-aggressive comment on social media, my mom left me a voicemail. Her tone was clipped and businesslike, a stark contrast to the tearful pleas she'd made before I moved out. She explained that they were struggling financially and needed my help. Jack had another court fine to pay, and Emily's school fees were overdue. The implication was clear. It was my duty to step up. Hearing her words felt like a punch to the gut. I'd expected some sort of reaction from them eventually, but I hadn't anticipated this. It wasn't an apology or an acknowledgement of how hard I'd worked for them all these years. It was a demand, plain and simple. They needed money, and they assumed I'd fall back into my old role without question. I sat with the voicemail for hours, playing it over in my head as I tried to sort through my emotions. Part of me wanted to help them. They were my family, after all. But another part of me bristled at the idea of being dragged back into the cycle I'd worked so hard to escape. I'd just started to find my footing, to carve out a life that was mine and mine alone. Was I really willing to jeopardize that for people who had taken me for granted for so long? By the time I went to bed, my mind was made up. I wasn't the same person I'd been 2 months ago. I'd fought too hard to reclaim my life to let them pull me back in now. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that this was just the beginning of a new kind of battle. It didn't take long for my family's demands to escalate. After I ignored my mom's voicemail, she resorted to dropping by my apartment unannounced. The first time, she came alone, claiming she just wanted to check on me. I tried to stay polite, but it was clear she was fishing for money. When I stood my ground and told her I couldn't help, she left in a huff. I hoped that would be the end of it, but I should have known better. A week later, my sister Emily showed up. She stood at my doorstep, suitcase in hand, insisting that she needed to move in with me. Apparently, she'd had a falling out with my mom and decided that I was the solution to her problems. She didn't ask, she demanded, like it was her right. I could feel my patience wearing thin, but I calmly explained that this wasn't possible. My apartment was barely big enough for me, let alone someone else, and besides, I'd moved out to create boundaries, not to become a second mother to my sister. Emily didn't take it well. She accused me of being heartless and selfish, throwing in every guilt-inducing phrase she could think of. When I didn't budge, she stormed off, shouting that I'd regret turning my back on her. I tried to shake it off, but her words lingered, a reminder of how deeply ingrained their expectations were. Things came to a head the following weekend. I was hosting a small gathering with Lisa, Janet, and Brian when there was a loud knock at the door. Before I could answer, the door flew open and there they were, my mom, Jack, and Emily. My mom started in immediately, her voice dripping with faux concern as she berated me for abandoning them. Jack, on the other hand, went straight for intimidation. He paced around my living room, muttering about how I'd better remember where I came from while glaring at Brian. Emily, true to form, launched into a dramatic tirade, accusing me of tearing the family apart. She even tried to pull Lisa and Janet into it, asking if they knew how cruel I'd been. It was a spectacle, and my friends were clearly uncomfortable. Brian stepped in, trying to calm the situation, but Jack turned on him, shouting that he had no business interfering in family matters. That was my breaking point. I stood up, shaking with anger, and told them all to leave. My voice was firm, louder than I'd ever heard it, but they didn't budge. My mom dismissed me with a wave. Emily crossed her arms like a petulant child, and Jack took a step toward me, his posture aggressive. For a split second, I felt a pang of fear, but then I remembered something important. This was my space. They had no power here unless I let them. Without hesitating, I grabbed my phone and called the building's security. I explained the situation, my voice trembling but resolute. When Jack realized what I was doing, he lunged for the phone, but Brian blocked him, keeping him at bay until security arrived. By the time the guards showed up, Jack was yelling obscenities, Emily was in tears, and my mom was trying to convince everyone that this was just a misunderstanding. The guards escorted them out, but Jack didn't go quietly. His shouting drew the attention of other tenants, and someone must have called the police because, minutes later, a squad car pulled up. When the officers arrived, they assessed the situation and decided to take Jack in for disorderly conduct. Watching him get cuffed was surreal. I felt a mix of relief and sadness, but mostly, I felt free. After they were gone, the apartment was eerily quiet. Lisa and Janet stayed to help me clean up, and Brian held my hand, offering silent support. I felt a wave of exhaustion, but also a sense of accomplishment. For the first time, I'd stood up to my family and held my ground, even when things got ugly. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the events in my mind. It hadn't been easy, and I knew it wouldn't be the last time they tried to push back. But I also knew that I'd taken a crucial step in reclaiming my life. This was my space, my sanctuary, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me again. The fallout from that night at my apartment sent ripples through my family, each one widening the distance between us. Not long after Jack's arrest, I learned he was facing a prison sentence. His previous offenses, which had been piling up over the years, finally caught up with him. There was no more room for leniency, and the court made that clear. The news didn't surprise me, but it left me feeling hollow. I'd spent so much time trying to clean up his messes, hoping he'd change, but this was where his choices had led him. Emily's downward spiral wasn't far behind. Without me around to cushion her from the consequences of her actions, she turned to a crowd that offered her the validation she craved, no matter how toxic it was. Parties, late nights, and reckless decisions became her new normal. When I heard she'd been arrested for shoplifting, it felt like a punch to the gut. I wanted to reach out, to pull her back from the edge, but I stopped myself. Every instinct screamed at me to step in, but I knew it wouldn't help. She needed to face the reality of her choices, just like Jack had. My mom, meanwhile, was barely holding it together. With Jack gone and Emily slipping further away, she had no one left to lean on. The financial strain I'd carried for years fell squarely on her shoulders, and she wasn't equipped to handle it. The house that had once been our family home became a shadow of itself. Without money for repairs or upkeep, it started to crumble. Worse, people began to take advantage of the situation. Neighbors mentioned squatters, strangers coming and going, as if they owned the place. It wasn't just a home anymore, it was a liability. I learned all of this secondhand, through whispers and updates from mutual acquaintances. My mom never reached out directly, and neither did Emily. The silence was deafening, but I couldn't bring myself to break it. Part of me felt guilty, knowing they were struggling, but another part felt a deep sense of relief. I'd spent so long trapped in their chaos, sacrificing my own well-being to hold them together. Now, for the first time, their problems weren't mine to fix. Still, the guilt lingered. I'd catch myself wondering if I'd done the right thing, if there was more I could have done to help them. But then I'd remember all the years I'd spent giving and giving, only to be met with ingratitude and demands for more. My efforts hadn't saved them then, and they wouldn't save them now. They had to want to change, and that wasn't something I could force. One day, out of curiosity, I drove past the house. It was unrecognizable. The lawn was overgrown, the windows boarded up, and graffiti marred the once pristine walls. A car sat abandoned in the driveway, its tires flat and its body rusting. I parked down the street, watching from a distance as a group of strangers milled about on the porch. It was a stark reminder of how far things had fallen. As I sat there, memories of my childhood flashed through my mind. Birthday parties in the backyard, movie nights in the living room, the way the kitchen used to smell like cookies and cinnamon on the weekends. It was hard to reconcile those memories with what I saw now. The house had been more than just a building. It had been the anchor of our family. Seeing it in this state was heartbreaking, but it also felt like closure. This was the end of an era, and I wasn't part of it anymore. I left without going inside, knowing there was nothing for me there. On the drive home, I thought about my mom, struggling to make ends meet in what was essentially a shell of a home. I thought about Emily, likely bouncing from one bad decision to the next, and Jack, sitting in a cell, paying the price for his actions. I felt a mix of emotions, sadness, frustration, and, surprisingly, a sense of peace. Their lives were still a mess, but mine didn't have to be. For the first time in years, I wasn't drowning in their problems. My apartment was still small, my savings modest, but I had stability, something I'd never had before. I was building a life that was mine, free from the constant demands and guilt that had weighed me down for so long. The path ahead wasn't perfect, but it was mine to walk, and that was enough. As the weeks went by, the updates about my family grew fewer and farther between. I stopped seeking them out, choosing instead to focus on the life I was creating. I found new hobbies, deepened my friendships, and even started thinking about going back to school. The weight I'd carried for so long was gone, replaced by a quiet determination to make the most of this new chapter. Every now and then, I'd catch myself wondering if they were okay. I'd think about reaching out, but I never did. Not because I didn't care, but because I knew that to truly move forward, I had to let go. My family's story wasn't mine to rewrite. All I could do was write my own. As time passed, my life took on a rhythm that felt almost foreign in its steadiness. For years, my existence had been consumed by putting out fires, each one more chaotic than the last. Now, for the first time, my days were my own, and I was determined to make them count. Work became a source of pride rather than a burden. I took on new responsibilities at the diner, learning the ropes of management, and even suggesting improvements that impressed my boss. The extra effort paid off when I was offered a promotion, complete with better pay and a more stable schedule. With each step forward, I felt a growing sense of accomplishment. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was thriving. Outside of work, my relationships flourished. Lisa and Janet became like sisters to me, their unwavering support a constant reminder of how far I'd come. We celebrated each other's successes, shared our struggles, and spent countless evenings laughing over drinks or bad TV. Brian, too, became a cornerstone of my new life. Our casual relationship deepened over time, and before I knew it, we were making plans for a future together. He proposed on a quiet evening in my apartment, and I said yes, without hesitation. It wasn't the grand, dramatic gesture I'd once imagined, but it was perfect in its simplicity. It felt right. As my own life blossomed, my family's continued to unravel. Jack's imprisonment stretched into years, his repeated offenses leaving little room for redemption. Emily's reckless behavior showed no signs of slowing down, and I heard she'd been in and out of trouble ever since her arrest. My mom's financial struggles worsened, and the house, once the heart of our family, was eventually seized due to unpaid debts. Each update I received felt like a reminder of the life I'd escaped. I'd be lying if I said it didn't hurt. There were moments when I'd sit alone, wondering if I should have done more. But those moments grew fewer and farther between as I embraced the truth. Their choices weren't my responsibility. I'd spent years trying to fix everything, only to realize that the only person I could truly save was myself. That realization was liberating. My family's decline became a cautionary tale for me, a reminder of what happens when boundaries are ignored and self-respect is sacrificed. It wasn't about blame, it was about learning. Their struggles taught me to value my own well-being and to protect it fiercely. Every time I caught myself slipping into old habits, overcommitting, neglecting my needs for others, I thought of them, and it brought me back to center. One evening, as I was packing up some boxes in preparation for moving into a larger apartment with Brian, I came across a photo from my childhood. It was of the four of us, my mom, Jack, Emily, and me, smiling in front of the house that no longer belonged to us. For a moment, I felt a pang of sadness, a longing for the days when things seemed simpler. But as I stared at the photo, I realized how much I'd grown. The girl in that picture had no idea how strong she would become, how much she would endure and overcome. She didn't know that one day she'd choose herself and find happiness on her own terms. I tucked the photo away, not out of regret, but as a token of how far I'd come. It was a part of my story, but it didn't define me anymore. As I settled into my new life with Brian, I found peace in the small things. Cooking dinner together, planning trips, dreaming about the future. My world had once been consumed by chaos, but now it was filled with hope. I wasn't naive enough to think everything would always be perfect, but I knew I had the strength to face whatever came my way. I'd proven that to myself time and time again. Looking back, I felt no guilt for the decisions I'd made. Walking away from my family's dysfunction had been the hardest thing I'd ever done, but it was also the best. It gave me the chance to build a life that was mine, one filled with love, stability, and purpose. I didn't owe anyone an explanation or apology. For the first time, I truly believed I deserved the happiness I'd worked so hard to create. In the quiet moments, I often reflected on the journey that brought me here. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't without pain, but it was mine. And for that, I was endlessly grateful.